I'm delighted to welcome all of you to the educational workshop co-sponsored by CRCAIH, the Collaborative Research Center for American Indian Health. For the past 5 years, CRCAIH has worked and provided a platform to bring together tribal communities and researchers to help build tribal research capacity. Today, you'll hear from a tribal IRB panel on the work that they've done in establishing tribal IRBs, and also hear their experience in review of special circumstances for research in tribally based communities. We'll also learn and discuss what's current and upcoming in community-based and clinical research. So thank you all for coming. I know that some of you have traveled long distances to get here, so I appreciate your attendance at the event. And I'd like to sincerely thank members of the Office for Human Research Protection for making this happen for us. And finally, last but not the least, Mother Nature for such a great weather. So welcome, everybody. Before we get started, I think we'll have Misty tell us some housekeeping stuff.
Thank you, Jyoti, and I want to thank Sanford Health for Sanford Research for bringing us here today to co-host this workshop with you. This is a great opportunity for OHRP to come and have a chance to talk with you about the regulations, the current and the new regulations that we'll be talking about today. And so we look forward to this opportunity to working with you, handling questions. We expect the day to be quite interactive. So please know that our goal is not to be talking heads and lecturing the whole time. We're actually going to put you to work a little bit today as well. My name is Misty Alt-Anderson, and I'm in our Division for Education and Development at OHRP. And in a moment, I'll introduce to you Ivor Pritchard, who will be doing our first talk. He is the Senior Advisor to the Director of OHRP. We have a team of people at OHRP, and one of our goals that not a lot of people know about is to go out and do education and outreach with the idea that if we can get out into the community and teach the regulated community, well, how to interpret, how to use and apply the rules, ideally that you never have to see the rest of the office. And so we take that very seriously, and we enjoy getting out and working with members of the regulated community and investigators and other interested parties. So we really do value these opportunities. So as far as housekeeping goes, you have in front of you a couple of things that I want to point out. First of all, you have a copy of the regulations booklet. Just to disappoint you a little bit, these are the current regulations that you're looking at. They are not the revised common rule. We have not printed those yet. So those will happen. That will happen in the future sometime. But today we'll be talking about both. And so we're going to do some work with the current rule as well. So you have a copy of that in front of you. The other thing that you have in front of you of interest, and so the regulations booklet you get to keep. The other thing you don't get to keep is the clicker on the lanyard. You'll notice it looks almost like a little remote control. Have anyone used these before? Are you familiar at all with these technologies? Oh, good, a number of you. So this is a way for us to interact with you throughout our talks and get immediate feedback that is completely anonymous. So we, at various points in our talks, are going to ask you to answer questions. We'll do polling questions and that sort of thing. And this allows you to vote and see what, it'll throw graphs up on the screen, see what your answer, how it compares to everyone else in the room, that sort of thing. But it is completely anonymous, so the pressure is off. So we'll talk about those. I will say, so we'll take those back with us. My boss would kill me if I didn't point out that they're like crazy expensive, which is why we have them on lanyards and sitting on the table. So I ask you just to leave them on the table as you walk around or whatever. And but please don't accidentally, when you pick up all your papers, that's what the lanyard helps with that. Sometimes they can get lost in a stack just because they're expensive to replace. And like everybody, we're all on a tight budget. So you'll hear me say that a few times during the day, and you'll get tired of me saying it. Feel free to laugh at me. So I think that is it. You will have, I understand Jyoti's going to make available to you copies of our slides after the workshop. So feel free, take, whatever notes you want to take, but know that the slides will be made available to you afterwards today. And you'll be able to access them with no problem. So with that, are there any questions before I hand it over? No? Okay, well then we'll go ahead and jump right in. So I'm going to hand the mic over to Ivor Pritchard, who is Senior Advisor to the Director of OHRP. He's going to kick us off with an overview of the new rules. Turn this off and activate your mic.
Thank you, Misty. Are we working? Is this thing going? Can you hear me? Do I sound amplified?
No.
I don't sound amplified.
No.
Do I sound more amplified?
Yes.
Do I sound amplified now? No. Okay. Then we will go to Plan B. I used to work in the U.S. Department of Education. I noticed that the two front tables are empty. Everybody's sitting in the back of the classroom. I know what that is about. Hey, here come the A students. Late as usual. I'm going to be giving an overview of the new regulations. But because of this particular audience, I am going to be blending in those considerations that are of particular interest, I presume, to the American Indian and Alaska Native communities. I'm really happy to be here. I come from Washington, D.C. Show of hands, how many of you are from Sioux Falls? Okay, a few of you. How many of you are from somewhere else? Show of hands. Yeah, had to have your hand up one time or the other. Okay, and you should be happy to be here too. And in fact, there is research evidence, solid empirical evidence, demonstrating why you should be happy. No, that's the wrong one. It's not going to let me out. Try that. Okay. A study was recently done of the 150 largest cities in the United States using the research from positive psychology and identifying 3 dimensions of happiness and using 30 indicators of happiness ranked within those dimensions in order to decide what the happiest cities in the United States are. And I come from number 10, Washington, D.C., 10th overall. We're number 6 in income and employment dimension. That may change soon. Maybe the number 2 and lowest suicide rate, maybe even that. But notice that Sioux Falls is number 5 overall in the United States of the happiest cities in the United States, largely because of the dimension of the community environment dimension. And notice number 2, adequate sleep indicator. Number 2. This, I think, is especially reassuring to me because I'm about to give an hour-and-a-half talk with no breaks. And so I'm really hoping that they did this research well, and so my audience will stay awake. We'll see. So here's the outline of what I'm going to be talking about, giving a background, talking about the transition provision. We had in 2015 a notice of proposed rulemaking saying what we thought we were going to do and obtaining public comments. And we got thousands of public comments, and we got some comments specifically from self-identified representatives of American Indian and Alaska Native populations. And I'm going to talk about the content of those comments. Feeling a little bit of trepidation about that because looking at the authors of those comments, there's a fairly decent chance, well, we'll find out. Show of hands, was anybody in this room part of the process of submitting those comments? Okay, so there are a few of you here who can correct me if I misrepresent what you all said in your public comments. And then I'm going to talk about the various features of the rule and how they changed, particularly with respect to the issues that were identified in the public comments as being of particular concern. In general, our rationale for revising the regulations was twofold. We wanted to improve human subjects protections. And secondly, we wanted to take advantage of the lessons of the last several decades to identify those things that were in the original regulations that required people to do things in various ways, but as it turned out, didn't provide meaningful protections to human subjects and wasted people's time and effort, and so we wanted to get rid of those. This is a graphic showing basic rulemaking process. This is why my hair is white. We started actually before 2011 because we had to have something in hand to publish in 2011 as an advance notice. Took us 4 years after getting the public comments to come up with a second set of proposals about how we wanted to revise the rules. We got public comment again. And on January 19th, 2017, interesting date, we published the final regulations. And notice that we are not done yet. You know, as bureaucrats, we sort of felt like on January 19th we had crossed the finish line because we had published a final rule in the Federal Register. But that's only for the bureaucrats. In terms of the people who actually administer the regulations, there's another step that has to take place, and that's the implementation of the rules, which starts in January 2018 in general for the regulations, and there's a specific provision about the use of single IRBs in multi-site studies that there are 3 years before implementation takes place. So, how does this implementation thing work? And you're going to see on all of these slides, I think on the slides of my colleagues too, there's this awkward reference to the pre-2018 rule. You know, well, you're sort of curious, why don't you just call it the 2017 rule, because that's where we are, right? Why don't you just call it the current rule? The problem is that time passes, and every time you write something down, if time passes and changes the status of the rule, right, what counts as the new rule, what counts as the current rule, what counts as the existing rule, the reference changes with time, and so we have to make use of this odd locution of referring to the pre-2018 rule as referring to the rule that is currently in play. Now, it is possible that if there is a provision that's consistent with the current rule, you'll hear, because I can do this verbally, you'll hear me slip some of the time when I talk about what it is. There are some provisions consistent with the current rule that are in the new rule, which if an institution wanted to already start conforming to, you could do that today. So like there's an additional element of informed consent that one could add to one's informed consent forms right now, but we couldn't enforce compliance with it. All studies, if you start after 2018 on January 19th, you've got to comply with the revised rule, and the single IRB requirement comes into play in 2020. So here's a graphic that shows you the three, more or less the three options for the rules as we go through the transition. If you look in the upper left, things that are already ongoing need to follow the same rules, the existing rules. But if you look in the upper right, What about a study that starts before January 19th and goes of 2018 and goes past that date? What do you have to do? The default position is that you go with the old rule. You keep playing by the rules of the same game. We don't want to force you to switch to playing by the rules of a different game after you've started. So the default is that you stay with the rules of the same game. But if you want to start playing the new game by the new rules, you can switch a study that's somewhere in the middle to the new rules. And then down on the lower right-hand side, if you start a research study after January 19th, 2018, then it's a new game, and playing by the new rules is the only option. So, the tribal comments, I looked in the public comments and was able to identify 9 comments from people representing tribal organizations of one sort or another. A fairly high degree of overlap between those comments, a lot of reference to the comments from the National Council for the American Indians, and there was one comment by an individual who did not identify herself as being a representative of a Native American organization or herself a Native American, but by a web search I'm pretty confident that she does work at a Native American organization, and that she is a Native American. And here are the general themes that we identified in those comments. Recognize tribal sovereignty explicitly in the regulations. Require that there be some form of tribal consultation for any research conducted with a Native American population. That for research involving biospecimens, pretty much regardless whether it's identifiable or not, that there be consent obtained for the biospecimen research. And very often that consent occur both at the individual and the tribal level. That there be a consideration of community and cultural benefit in the evaluation of any research study, and that there be concerns about reviewing research studies in terms of the possibilities of harm or cultural stigmatization. And that particularly for the proposed requirement that for any multi-site study conducted in the domestic United States, that there be a single IRB for reviewing that entire study. The public comments wanted an exception for the participation of any tribal population. And that if there was not going to be such an exception, that as a sort of second best, that the IRB would need to be a tribal IRB for this as the single IRB of record. And finally, a concern about overseeing the work of investigators, particularly in view of the larger proportion of research studies that will be exempt under the new regulations. So this slide identifies the explicit response in the revised common rule. Until the revised common rule, if you looked at the current rule, the ANPRM, the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, there are no explicit references to tribal authorities whatsoever. So the federal government really made a significant change in trying to communicate by including 5 provisions that are explicitly recognizing tribal authorities to acknowledge the existence and role of tribal entities in activities that have to do with research involving human subjects. So this is an effort to communicate a message about recognizing the legitimate status of those entities. And I'm going to, as I go through the overview, I'm going to talk about what the actual significance of those various things are, because they vary pretty considerably. I'm not going to read these, but just so that you have sort of fair warning, this is a list of the changes that that are in the new rule that I'm going to be talking about. All right, so let's talk about 2. And in red, I've put the reference to the tribal entities. And I want to talk about the lower one first. There's in the rule, the provision already exists in the old rule in black. And all it does here is to include a recognition of that this applies to tribal entities too. And this is something that's really actually fairly peripheral to research per se. All it really says is that there's nothing about these regulations that should stand in the way of somebody who has the appropriate authority, including tribal authority, to provide emergency clinical care to somebody, right? So it isn't as if you can say to somebody, stop providing emergency care to that person. This person is in a research study, and so you can't do that, right? So it's a very focused provision, right? It's it's a significant one if you happen to be the person who's in that emergency situation, right? But it's certainly from the standpoint of the conduct of research, it's a niche sort of topic, right? The one on top is more or less the opposite, because this is a very wide-ranging provision saying that basically any condition that a tribal entity using its lawmaking process puts into place that provides additional protections for human subjects, the regulations can't stand in the way of the force of that law. So, for example, in California now, there's a Bill of Rights that research subjects have to be given when they go through the consent process. There's nothing in our regulations that says that that Bill of Rights has to be given to anybody, but this provision basically says that the federal government can't get in the way of California saying you have to give this Bill of Rights to research subjects. Now, there are, and of course what this is doing is recognizing that tribal entities can do the same thing. Now, it's important to notice exactly how this works, because in a way, this provision does nothing at all, because it doesn't add any additional compliance issue for the federal regulators, right? It doesn't add a new protection into the federal regulations themselves. It just says that if a state, local, tribal entity wants to add something, the feds won't get in the way. So from a compliance standpoint, for a federal regulator, nothing changes, right? To take the California example, if somebody complains to our office that the California Bill of Rights isn't being given to research subjects, so long as the researchers aren't invoking federal authority not to do it, right? It's a matter of California's enforcement mechanism to make sure that that wrong gets corrected. Notice that this also is effectively saying if tribal entities want to have additional protections for human subjects in their communities, there's something you have to do, right? You have to get whatever rule or lawmaking entity the tribal organization has to go ahead and create such an obligation. But I think that even that notwithstanding, while it doesn't make a change at the level of compliance, this provision represents a significant difference at two other levels which I think are quite important. First of all, it obviously makes a change at a symbolic level of saying, right, tribal entities we recognize have the same legitimacy as other state or local entities. And the other is at a practical level. IRBs generally, I think, look to the regulations for guidance about what they're supposed to be doing as they're reviewing research studies. And what this provision is going to do is it's going to make all of those IRBs say, wait a minute, this is a research study that is going to involve a tribal population, and see right here in the regulations it says you have to worry about state and local law and tribal law. So I think that at a pragmatic level, this provision is actually going to make a significant difference, even though at a compliance level it doesn't. The definition of research in the regulations, the generic definition has not been changed. It's still a systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. But there are 4 specific activities now that, for purposes of clarity, the regulations themselves say these don't count. Whatever their features, these don't count under the definition of research, if it is true that you're kind of scratching your head and looking at the activity and seeing there's collecting information and that there is some kind of plan and trying to say, well, is this research or not, right? These 4 provisions are aimed at saying, well, if we're talking about any one of these 4 activities, those don't fall under the regulations. And the one I want to draw to your attention is the second one, which is the one that has to do with public health surveillance activities. If you look at the information from the Centers for Disease Control, we're having trouble here. They have a lot of guidance about what counts as a public health surveillance activity. And when you think about it, public health surveillance activities a lot of the time do seem to do the kinds of things that are a lot like descriptive research studies, where you're collecting information from a large population of individuals, aggregating it and identifying percentages of people with this, with vaccinations, with these conditions, whatever. Is it or isn't it research? If it's only a public health surveillance activity, it's not impeded by the regulations. And specifically, there's this provision saying that one of the legitimate public health surveillance authorities can be a tribal organization. The largest and most important change in the regulations that has to do with improving protections are the changes which have to do with informed consent. Ever since this activity started, there have been widespread complaints and expressions of dissatisfaction about the way the informed consent process goes and in particular what's included in informed consent forms, and how at the end of the day, even though you spend a lot of time and paper and ink conforming to the regulations, real questions are raised about how well subjects who agree to participate in studies understand what they're getting into. And the regulations are trying to change that. The first thing is to attach this notion of a reasonable person standard, which appears in other contexts, legal contexts, etc. And so it wants to say, think about the subject as a reasonable person and ask what information does that person need to have in order to make a decision about participation. So it doesn't mean give them all the information about the activity that exists. Rather, it says, think about the things that probably should be taken into consideration when somebody makes a decision about being in or out. And the revised regulations follow this up with talking about the kind of information. And notice when you look at these two bullets, there's a bit of a tension here, because the first one says, keep it short, right? Don't overwhelm the person with too much information, like having them read 15 pages of side effects of various drugs that are part of the research study. At the same time, the second bullet says you got to give them enough detail so that with respect to the key things that are going to affect their decision, they do know enough about the details of what the risks and potential benefits are, that they really understand what's going on. They need to be told that, for example, this research study is going to be measuring its outcomes in terms of whether the tumor changes in size. But the study isn't actually going to be asking the question, does this change how long you survive with your cancer? Right? That kind of detail potentially might make a difference to somebody in deciding whether to participate in the study, because what actually matters to them, presumably, is how long they're going to live, not necessarily the size of the tumor. There are additional elements that are added to the informed consent provisions. Some of them, or one of them, is a provision that always needs to be added, and then there are 3 provisions that are added if it's appropriate. The top one should be of particular interest to this group because it says the informed consent form has to say whether there is the possibility that biospecimens that are originally collected in that study could subsequently be stripped of identifiers and used for further research. As I'm going to point out in a little while, currently, if you have a biospecimen that doesn't have identifiers, technically under the regulations, it doesn't qualify for the definition of human subject, and so the regulations don't apply. And so people are entitled, researchers are entitled, to take a biospecimen that the identifiers have been stripped off of and do whatever they want without any oversight. Now, this might well include, for example, say you have a research study which has been conducted almost entirely within a population of natives of the Sioux tribe. You strip all of the identifiers, the individual identifiers, off of those biospecimens. Under the regulations, you can do whatever research study you want, right? Which, in the public comments, this is something about which those commenters have expressed some concerns, right? What this provision is saying is you've got to tell somebody when you're getting informed consent from them whether that might happen or not, so that the person can decide whether they want to participate in the initial study or whether they want to say, no, if you're saying to me that my specimen could later be used for other purposes so long as you take the identifiers off and don't let me know about this, no, I'd rather not participate in the study. Then the other three additional elements have to do with things that weren't big issues in 1991 when the Common Rule was first adopted, but now have gotten a lot more attention. People are interested in whether they might get some commercial profit from from being a subject in a research study. Generally, we expect that what they're going to be told under this additional element is no, but at least they'll know that. People, we know from research studies, generally actually expect that they're going to get the results of studies given back to them. Very often it's the case that they aren't, but that is a common expectation people have. Now, where appropriate, they're going to need to be told whether this might or might not happen. And then the last thing, which I think may well be of a concern to this particular group as well, is there's a lot of attention being paid to whole genome sequencing now because it's, I think, recently gone under the threshold of $1,000 in order to sequence somebody's entire gene. Now it's going to be the case that people are going to have to be told whether that kind of procedure may be used with their biospecimen. Okay. There is, in broad consent, there is another provision that has to do with something that is explicitly recognized for tribal entities. As with that emergency treatment circumstance, this provision says that there's nothing you can do under research that falls under the regulations that stops, effectively, a tribal entity from having a requirement that additional information be provided to the subjects of the study. So if a tribal entity wants to put additional information to be provided to the subjects, it is not possible to object to that information, whatever it is. All right? This is for any information. So again, we're back to that notion that the regulations themselves, by doing this, they don't actually add any specific protection. However, they explicitly leave the door open to say that if a tribal entity wishes to add an additional information requirement for subjects participating in a study over which they have authority, they can do that. There's another provision that's gotten a good bit of attention, which is a new thing. We, in our office, fairly frequently, in looking at research studies, asking questions about how research studies are conducted, we often have a good bit of trouble securing informed consent forms because institutions, some institutions, tend to be pretty closed-mouthed about the informed consent forms that they're using. And we think we understand that in some cases there's proprietary information that's disclosed in the informed consent form, and that we don't want to make it the case that that information has to be included. But we think it would be a good thing if everybody could see what kinds of informed consent forms institutions are using, for really two primary reasons. The first is transparency. That, if you think that presumably you ought to believe that your informed consent form is doing an adequate job of giving people the information that they need to have in order to make a reasonable decision about participation. And so you shouldn't be wary of having people know, third parties know, because we really should be concerned even more about the individual who's actually getting that information, what's in the consent form. So it's a kind of transparency argument that everybody should be willing to say, here's how we're conducting this research. We believe we're protecting people and informing them adequately. And if you want to see what information we gave them and how we gave it to them, here's our form. The second is that we think that this would provide a significant learning resource. Everybody still frets about how to do a good job of doing informed consent. We also currently have a whole lot of attention being paid to carrying out informed consent form using various kinds of electronic media. And what does that mean? Can you get consent electronically, etc.? And what kind of information can you provide to people if you're trying to get consent from them in a study on the World Wide Web? If we have those informed consent forms available, we're hoping that there are going to be useful lessons to be learned from each other about various tricks for conveying information more successfully to people. What if you look at an informed consent form and see that the analogy that is being used for explaining randomization is maybe better than flipping a coin, right? And you say, hey, I never thought about using that analogy to explain randomization. Maybe this is a better way of, maybe that's something we can incorporate in our informed consent form. There is a new provision which I think arguably may be of interest to the people in this room, about waiver of informed consent, which says that in addition to the existing criteria for a waiver of informed consent, in order to get a waiver of informed consent, one needs to be able to demonstrate that the research could not practicably be carried out without accessing or using identifiers. Whoop. Can I go back? Maybe, if I hit that button. Yeah. We're not expecting a lot of people to actually satisfy this criterion. Rather, what we think this is going to do is it's going to push investigators in the direction of stripping identifiers from the specimens or data, right? So there may well be some studies where people just don't bother and they can still get a waiver. What this provision is saying is, no, if you want to get a waiver, you're going to have to be able to explain why you have to keep those identifiers. Otherwise, you got to take the identifiers off. Good. The advantage of this provision, of course, is that without identifiers, that provides additional protections to the human subjects. The downside, from the perspective of people in this room, is that recognize that this is going to create a larger proportion of those kinds of studies which people may have some concerns about, where investigators are doing research with biospecimens that don't have individual identifiers, but may well still have information associated with them that reflects the fact that the specimens are all drawn from a specific population, which might be a tribal population. There's a new exemption, which I'll talk about just a little bit, but I think it does deserve mention because this is entirely new and I think it's going to be of particular interest to a lot of people doing psychology research. Show of hands. How many of you were an undergraduate student and were part of a research study because you were in the intro psych course and you could get credit for participating in a research study instead of reading an article and writing an abstract? Show of hands. Okay, so this is really what that exemption is about. We're saying that there are a lot of those studies where you look at slides of people, you look at various people's faces, and you have to make decisions about how old they are or whether they're smart or not or whatever, right? And it takes 20 minutes, and they collect the information anonymously, and you're done, right? This exemption is designed to keep those kinds of studies from having to go to an institutional review board, because the fact that you're being shown those pictures constitutes some kind of intervention. This is an exemption which does have terms that arguably involve a significant amount of wiggle room, if you wish, right? How long is brief in duration? What counts as harmless? If they're going to be bored, does that count as a harm and kick it out of this exemption, right? There are going to be these debates as this exemption gets utilized, and we recognize that guidance is going to be needed. In fact, we've already tasked but we still think that while that is going to mean there are going to be some gray area cases, it's going to be worthwhile to have this exemption because there are a considerable number of research studies that are, if you will, no-brainers, that they do fit this kind of exemption, and spending the time of the Institutional Review Board to review them doesn't make sense. So, I'm now at secondary research. And it's going to take me a while to get through secondary research because there are a lot of changes to the regulations which pertain in one way or another to secondary research. Regulations about secondary research that just uses specimens or information without actually touching or doing something to the living, breathing person is not the most exciting kind of research to talk about. And you've been sitting still for like 40 minutes. So this is not a break. But what I would like to ask you all to do is to just take a moment to stand up, right? And stretch a little, smile at the person next to you. Ask them if they're feeling happy to be in Sioux Falls, right? For 30 seconds, a minute. My colleague and I, Angela Vitfed, walked 18 miles around Sioux Falls yesterday, and I'm feeling a little stiff, so just sort of wiggle around.
Like that? I assume that's what it's got. It's about that long. Better 10 to 20 miles.
Scratching you today. Oh, when that for driving. Yeah. It's a good job driving.
Okay. Try to come back to the attentive pose. So that we can start talking about secondary research. And what I will say to you is once we get through the secondary research and a couple of other provisions that have to do with the new rules, we'll get to the piece right at the end, which I think involve the most kind of sensitive issues of research, which I'm hoping to get to soon enough so that we can talk about it. So, I already said basically what secondary research is. It's when you use information or biospecimen that belong to somebody, but you don't actually involve people themselves. You could either have gotten that information or specimen from a prior study, or you could have gotten it because there's some kind of record available that has been collected for some other purpose, or you sent in your saliva to 23andMe. So, the regulations have a bearing on secondary research in a whole lot of different ways, and what I'm going to try to do is to race through all of them to try and give you the overall picture. There are lots of details that I'm going to gloss over that have to do with these various categories, but I'm going to try and convey the impression that depending on how the secondary research is going to be done, there are various degrees of regulatory requirements that obtain. They divide into three general categories. One is where the research doesn't satisfy the definition of a human subject. The second is research that's exempt from some or all of the requirements. And then the third is when all the requirements apply. And just so, I don't remember whether this got announced before, but I'm seeing a couple of people take pictures of slides. All of these slides are going to be made available at some point at the end of this event.
We'll email these out to all the attendees after the event.
Okay. So, just so you know, you will be able to get all of this stuff. So, I've already talked about the content of this slide. The technical definition of human subject requires that it has to be identifiable in order for it to count as being private information. So long as you're not invoking the first provision and all you're doing is the second provision, if it's not identifiable, it's not counted as being research involving human subjects. Then there is an exemption, which is it exists as in the current rule, but it's been widened in several different ways. If you do have identifiable private information or identifiable specimens, the research is exempt if the identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens are publicly available. So one of the examples we've thought about is, let's say WikiLeaks makes a whole lot of information publicly available, which is clearly private information. That would be an example of something that would meet this exemption. This is the other provision in the existing regulations that also has to do with exempt research. If the researcher goes into the medical room and looks at the identifiable private information, but when she records the information, she doesn't write down the identifiers, that also counts as exempt research. But what's new about these two provisions is that in the current regulations, it's restricted to information that's existing at the time that the research is proposed. In the new regulations, even if what you're going to do is to look at some medical records that don't exist yet, you're going to be looking at the medical records for patients admitted to the hospital in the next year, right? So long as you don't record the identifiers, that research study will be exempt as well under the new regulations. Then there are a couple of additional ways in which secondary research meets this exemption. First, if the information is protected by HIPAA. Second, and this is one that probably you won't have much of a direct role in doing, but this is actually an exemption provision that is arguably self-interested on the part of the federal government. The federal government collects information through the IRS, through all sorts of mechanisms where the government collects. The census collects information. And so long as there is the protections of 3 federal statutes that are identified in the regulations, that kind of research is exempt as well. Then there's the provision regarding broad consent. And I think it's important to notice that the way in which broad consent functions in the new rule is significantly different from the way that it functioned in the notice of proposed rulemaking. The notice of proposed rulemaking, because it wanted to say that any specimen should be considered identifiable, was going to have the effect of pushing everybody who wanted to do research involving biospecimens in the direction of obtaining broad consent, because they weren't going to be able to use those specimens otherwise unless they got broad consent. In the new rule, as it actually has been finalized, the situation is fundamentally different. There were people who wanted to be able to use broad consent, but the way in which it's been presented in the new rule is it's a fundamentally optional sort of thing. If you want to implement a system for obtaining broad consent from research participants, you can do it, but it's fundamentally an elective thing. Broad consent can be used for all kinds of studies, and the broad consent either involves research studies that may be exempt, or the broad consent may apply to studies which still do have to meet the requirements of the rule. And the broad consent is a kind of all or nothing package. If you want to use broad consent at all, you have to use you have to meet all of the informational requirements of informed consent. You can't do what you can do under specific informed consent, which is you can get a waiver or alteration of informed consent where you provide some of the required information but not all of it. For broad consent, it's you buy the whole package. These are the elements that, in addition to ones that are the same as they are under specific informed consent, these are the elements that are required for broad consent that are different from the ones for specific informed consent. Because you can't talk about the actual studies that are going to be done. What you have to do as a kind of fallback is talk about the types of information. And here again, notice that there's a reasonable person standard here. The description has to give you enough information so that if one were to say, well, here's the actual study that we want to do, you ought to be able to look at the broad consent and say, the person who signed that consent form shouldn't be surprised that this particular study was going to be done. So say the broad consent form says, we're going to do secondary research studies which involve looking at the characteristics of cells that have cancer. And along comes somebody and they want to do a secondary research study, and they want to do a research study that looks at prostate cancer cells. In that circumstance, since they were told, we're going to use this for cancer research, it would be reasonable for somebody to say, yeah, you told me you were going to do this for cancer, and prostate cancer is a kind of cancer, and so, yeah, I'm not surprised that you were going to use my specimen for this purpose. If, on the other hand, the broad consent says, we're going to be using this research, your specimen, to study different kinds of cancer, and somebody comes along and says, I want to use the specimen to see if there is a genetic marker for anxiety, right? Then you'd have an opposite reaction where the person would say, wait a minute. I'm surprised that you're going to be doing a study, that kind of study with this specimen, because it doesn't have anything to do with cancer. In the public comments, with respect to the second item, the public comments from the tribal organizations often express concern about which investigators were going to be able to use information or specimens for secondary research. So the broad consent is going to have to tell them who that's going to be, presumably, hopefully impacting somebody's decision about whether they want to participate or not. And here again, just as with the specific informed consent provision, the broad consent, right, also has that open door provision that says that a tribal entity can require that additional information be attached to a broad consent form if that's what they want to do. So what does broad consent mean in terms of how you can go forward with it? The argument for having broad consent is that compared to no consent at all, broad consent at least gives somebody a general say in whether their specimen or information is going to get used. But there's a price to be paid for this, and there were reams of public comments in the NPRM about the implications of this, and this will still obtain if you decide to use a broad consent option. If you use broad consent, you're going to have to take it seriously, and that means you're going to have some way of labeling each specimen or information that you're holding on to say, did the person say yes or no? And if they said yes, what did they say yes to? If somebody was asked to provide broad consent and they said no, you can't go back to them, or you can't do a secondary study. So it might well be that the person said, no, I don't want to give you broad consent to the use of my specimen. And yet, had you asked that person about the specific study that you have in mind, they would have said yes, but now you don't have them available, so you can't ask them for their consent, right? This means that even though they might not have objected to this specific secondary study, having declined the broad consent means that their specimen's not available for research. There are two new exemptions that are attached to this notion of broad consent. And in general, they're thought to work together, but they can work independently of each other. The first one has to do with this is basically agreeing to have your specimen banked. And the requirements, and this is something that I'm sure we're going to have some blowback about, the term exempt in the regulations is actually changing its meaning somewhat from the current rules. Because in the current rule, so long as you fit an exemption category, no regulatory requirements applied. And so some people would say, exempt is exempt, right? So long as it truly is exempt, anybody who cares about common rule requirements should get out of my hair, because as long as I made the decision correctly about my study being exempt, no regulatory requirements apply. That is true of some exemptions in the new rule, but of other exemptions in the new rule, such as this one, while the term is appropriate because it means that there are some requirements of the rule that you're exempt from, there are some requirements of the regulations that do apply that you still have to pay attention to. And so in this case, if you want to get broad consent to store and bank specimens, you do have to meet the requirement for broad consent. There needs to be what's called limited IRB review of the broad consent process and form. So the IRB has to be able to look and make sure that the form contains all the information, and it has to consider the way in which the broad consent process will be performed at the institution in various contexts to ensure that it is indeed a voluntary and informed process. And the IRB needs to look at the privacy and confidentiality safeguards that are in place if there are going to be any changes made to the way in which the information is stored and maintained. Then there's the other member of the pair of exemptions here, which is when you come to actually wanting to use the specimens or information for a specific study, then there should be IRB review of, as I was using that example of, prostate cancer versus anxiety disorder. Does the study fall within the parameters of this specific informed broad consent? Because realize that institutions are able to design broad consent forms the way they want them, to be wider or not so wide. Again, looking at the confidentiality safeguards, and there's one thing that's not allowed if you want under this exemption is if you're planning on returning individual results as part of your study plan, right? You're going to be studying people, sort of classic example is you're going to be including in your research study whether you're going to be looking to see if they have the BRCA gene for breast cancer. And so you're saying, yeah, I'm going to look at that, and I'm planning, whenever I identify that characteristic, I'm planning on returning that individual result to the subjects. The notion here is that there's been sufficient discussion and argument and difference of opinion about the way in which individual results are returned to research subjects in ways that they will understand what the implications of those results are and not go overboard in terms of how they respond to being told, well, I said I would tell you about dispositions to cancer, and so I have to tell you that I found something which has a 1 in 10,000 chance of predicting a higher likelihood of cancer, right? How that information is conveyed is something that people are fairly concerned about, and so the notion is that the IRB would want to look at how that's going to happen, and so it wouldn't meet this exemption. And there needs to be documentation or waiver of the documentation. And then to complete the whole thing, remember that secondary research can be carried out with IRB review and approval and informed consent. If it's the case that you're not only going to ask somebody to participate in a primary study, but you know that you have an additional study that's related to your primary study, but it's not really part of that primary study, and you are going to want to conduct that study too, and so you're going to have the opportunity to talk to this person. You can get both the consent to the first study and to the second piggyback study under the regulatory requirements, just as you can now. And it's the case that you can ask for an IRB review and approval of a secondary research study with waiver of or alteration of informed consent if you're in a circumstance where it is personally identifiable information, so it is under the rule, it doesn't meet any of the exemptions, and you meet the criteria for waiver. This, when you get the packet emailed by whoever it is a graphic that just displays the various things I've been talking about. The ones in blue are the old ones. The ones in red are the new ones. The ones in purple are the ones that have been significantly changed but are revisions of current ones. So you don't need to get out the binoculars to read the text of this slide, but when you get it, hopefully you'll find it useful to seeing what all the options are. Now some other provisions that are changes in the new rule, trying to increase the number of studies that are expedited. The important thing about the change, I think, in the expedited review categories is that now, when you look to decide whether something's expedited or not, you have to decide whether it's a minimal risk study. Under the new regulations, the list of expedited research activities is going to be limited to things about which you can presume that they are minimal risk. So the default is going to be, if it's in one of those categories, the thinking is that it is a minimal risk study. Now, recognizing that regulations are a blunt instrument and don't always perfectly discriminate the risky from the less risky, the regulations do permit someone to say, yes, I see that this is in a category, an expedited review category, and ordinarily I would agree that it is a minimal risk study. But the circumstances of this study are sufficiently peculiar so that it actually does involve more risk than minimal risk. And so I'm going to kick it out of the expedited review category and record that fact because I don't think it's appropriate for this to go through expedited review. It should go to the full board. And it is true with regard to that provision for limited IRB review that's looking just at broad consent provisions and privacy and confidentiality provisions. That's a function which we are including as something that can go through limited expedited IRB review. We're also reducing the volume of continuing reviews. And so if it gets approved under expedited review, no continuing review is required. And these other provisions too, the default again is that if it's under one of these categories, continuing review doesn't provide a protection for human subjects that's worth the time and effort. The IRB can spend its time more fruitfully, looking more carefully at other research studies. But in a rare circumstance, you can override that too. Then here is the provision that is the most significant one that has to do with tribal concerns. There was a lot of controversy about this proposal in the NPRM, which has been preserved in the revised common rule that says that for multi-site studies conducted within the United States, single IRB review will be a requirement. The public comments from the general population said you should encourage it, but don't always require it because sometimes it's not appropriate. And specifically from the American Indian Alaska Native community, the concerns that tribal entities have are sufficiently distinctive that an IRB that is specifically concerned with the protection of the participation of those subjects in the study should have regulatory status. And in the final rule, we acknowledge to some degree both of those concerns. We changed the provision about creating exceptions in general. You can look at the wording. I won't talk about it in detail, but we changed the wording to make it somewhat more flexible for the single IRB review requirement in general. And we specifically said that, again, if tribal law requires IRB review, the single IRB requirement does not obtain. But to repeat myself, again, notice that this is something which will require a tribal entity to take action with regard to. The tribal entity will have to pass a law saying, we assert our authority to stipulate that either our IRB, or it could be any other tribal entity, right, has to approve a research study before the participation of the subjects of our population can participate in the study. I want to talk for a moment about this criterion. There was a wording change made in the approval criteria for reviewing and approving research studies, which is the criterion at A3 in the old rule that has to do with selection of subjects. There are 3 different places in the regulations that refer to guarding against coercion and undue influence and make reference to vulnerable populations. And the problem is that while it's, and this is a problem of regulatory crafting, the problem is that these provisions weren't written consistently. So in the different places in the regulations, depending on whether you're looking at it here or whether you're looking at it where it describes IRB membership or in the other place, which vulnerable populations get mentioned varies. And in one place it refers to coercion and undue influence specifically with respect to informed consent. In another it doesn't. And so this provision, along with the other 2, were made identical so that they always refer to vulnerable to coercion or undue influence, and identify the same populations as in the in the clause referring to such as being the same populations. That doesn't, what I want to draw your attention to is the first sentence of this criterion, which doesn't have to do with the informed consent process, but has to do with whether it is fair to choose a particular population to single out for that study. And I believe that this is the place where those concerns voiced by the American Indian and Alaska Native perspective may use this criterion to be asking the question that they raise in their public comments about community harm, stigmatization, and community benefit. This first sentence is the place where I believe it is appropriate for an IRB to be deciding whether a research study can go forward or not, depending on the purposes of the research and the setting in which the research will be conducted, right? So it's not, we didn't specifically say, worry about community benefit, worry about community stigmatization, worry about community harm, right? But this is the place where I believe the regulations historically have and still in the future can be used to have to do with that provision, with those considerations. Okay. Then there are three provisions that I just want to mention, all of which have to do with getting rid of administrative things that we just don't think provide meaningful protections. You need to have your IRB roster, but you don't have to keep giving it to us and changing it again in our system, which is kind of clunky sometimes. Are we recording this?
Yes, we are.
I just called us clunky.
You did. Publicly,
Okay.
on record.
All right. Federal official calls government clunky. I'm in trouble. You don't have to look at the grant application anymore to look at protection of human subjects issues because too often that information is obsolete or irrelevant. And we will no longer be giving institutions the option of checking the box of whether to apply the regulations or not to their research studies. We believe that it is overwhelmingly the case that institutions treat their research studies the same way, whether the regulations apply or not. And we believe that the time and effort required in reporting problems with those research studies wastes effort too often because institutions generally do a reasonably good job of correcting those problems themselves. Okay, so I've got a few minutes to talk about the things that I think are most interesting from an ethical point of view that have to do with the American Indian and Alaska Native population. And that is to talk for a moment about sort of the three most infamous cases of research involving these populations. And I understand, and I regularly hear people in this area say, we're going to be discouraging American Indian populations from actively participating in studies if we dwell too much on these studies. We know better. What we want to do is to leave these studies in the past and to more actively engage in participating and having our populations participate in research studies. And what I'm going to say in the rest of my remarks is my own personal opinion and does not represent necessarily the official position of the federal government. I think that general attitude is problematic. And the reason why I think it's problematic is because I think that the features of each of these studies, the basic model for research of these three studies, presents ethical challenge for research involving American Indian and Alaska Native populations that we are likely to see regularly occurring in the future. Let me try and explain why. In the public comments that we got, there were references to the Barrow study, one or two, and a lot of references to the Havasupai controversy. None of the public comments from the tribal organizations referred to the residential school nutrition studies. Show of hands, how many of you are familiar with these studies? Yeah, not all of you. Okay. So talk about this one first, if I can. Yeah, why is it doing that? Come on. Okay. So, the Canadian nutritional studies took place in the 1940s in Canada, across Canada. After World War II, the Canadian society was in pretty rough economic shape. The government did not have a lot of money. And it was widely recognized that the Department of Public Health was currently providing food and nutritional resources to residential schools of, they refer to them in Canada as Aboriginal peoples, at drastically substandard, sub-starvation level of food allocation. And in that circumstance, they conducted a number of studies to see whether they could improve the health of the students in the residential schools by providing them with additional nutritional and vitamin supplements of various kinds, which they used in different places, to see if they would improve the students' health, recognizing that the additional materials they were providing still were below the accepted levels, nutritional levels, identified by the Canadian government themselves. And that this study included some residential schools where they didn't add anything, because for scientific purposes, they wanted to know whether they needed a control group, right? And they wanted to know whether they'd get an improvement, and so they needed to measure them against a control. Now, this problem is not something which is peculiar to this circumstance. For those of you who paid attention in the 80s and 90s, there was an infamous study involving lead paint abatement in residential housing in Baltimore, where they studied various substandard, cheap ways to reduce the lead in housing to try and keep kids from getting too much lead in their blood, and led to a big controversy and a legal case. Right now, there is a research study of HIV prevention going on in 3 countries in Africa, where they are looking at the impact of an HIV prevention program in communities where they're introducing a program which is cheaper and not as good as the standard HIV prevention strategy in developed countries. And it's IRB review and approved, right? The problem is, what do you do in a circumstance where it is unrealistic to provide an intervention designed to help people that actually meets a developed country's standard for providing that support, because you believe that you need to find out whether there's some cheaper way of doing it that will make things better than they are now. And I submit to you that I think there are going to be a significant number of studies in under-resourced American tribal populations where the healthcare resources are clearly substandard that are going to be asking that question. And additionally, they're going to have to ask the question of whether including a control group where you don't do anything for them is justifiable. I need to go a little faster here. Second, the Barrow study of alcoholism in 1979, New York Times story is what created the huge controversy over this study. And there was all sorts of complaint about the way in which the study stigmatized the alcoholism in the Alaska Native population in North Slope. We talk a lot about community-based participatory research as the way to make sure that the community is involved in planning and carrying out the study so that they will endorse carrying out the study and will be able to make use of the community benefits. The Barrow study started in its origins with resources from Barrow, Alaska. They had a technical committee, and they had a steering committee that consisted of tribal elders, all of whom were involved in this study because they thought that the problem of alcoholism in Barrow was a serious problem that they wanted to find ways for their community to change. Turned out, interestingly enough, that at least according to some people who have looked at this study, the problem was one of age, that the steering committee consisted of relatively senior representatives of the tribal community, and the people who found it offensive were from a younger generation of the same population who weren't included, right? But what I want to submit to you is, for those of you who think that community-based participatory research is the way to go, that may well be, but it's not necessarily going to be an ironclad guarantee that you're going to be able to avoid the kinds of concerns about community benefit, stigmatization, harm to a particular community. And then, I keep on making this mistake at the end. Then last, as I have said in the section about secondary research and tried to emphasize, there are significant ways in which secondary research using biospecimens can be carried out without full informed consent, with only broad consent, with no consent necessarily, in circumstances where you may be able not to identify the individuals to whom those specimens belong, but you may still be able to identify the population to which those studies, those biospecimens belong. And so the issue that the Havasupai case had to do with, which was a circumstance where the original informed consent form made vague reference to other studies in a broad consent-ish sort of way, but then eventually it turned out that some members of the community were offended by the specific purposes that those specimens were repurposed for, is again going to be an issue which will be in play in future research studies. So I'm afraid I've taken that hour and a half. That's the bad news, because I would have liked to open for questions, but I think there will be time later in the day for discussion and questions.
After my talk, the plan is to have a session
Okay.
for both of our.
Great. So the bad news is we can't have discussion right now. The good news is that you're all still awake, and so either that sleep thing really is true,
We could do a couple of
or what?
do a couple of questions and take the
Well, but I think the other good news is people need a break. Don't you think? Yeah, I think so. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. But you will have a chance to, if you want to ask a question about what I've said a little further on. But let's try and stay on time and go get some coffee and do whatever else you need to do, and be back ready to
10:30.
pay attention. What?
10:30.
10:30.
Yes.
Ready, steady, go. Thank you.